Hello, everybody. This is Amy Proffitt, Director of Marketing and Media for CHIME. And today we have a very special guest with us, but I will not steal his thunder. I will let him introduce himself.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for having me today. My name is David Finn, and I'm the EVP of Strategic Innovation at CynergisTek, a company focused on security, privacy, and compliance in the healthcare space. And I always add that I actually spent about 25 years in the provider space. So I do understand the pain that our providers and everyone in the care continuum is going through right now. We live in crazy times.
Yes, we do. And I think your insight's really interesting. You lived on both sides of the fence, so to speak. And I think you probably don't have any 2 days that are alike, and there are probably no boring days as well in cybersecurity.
I'm sorry to say that is correct.
So what I want to do is start and take a few steps back. Back in January, you all authored a blog that was Cybersecurity has changed forever. And we just had a tremendous response to that. And so I think it's still very important to touch on. And I want to just ask the very open-ended question, how has cybersecurity changed in the last 6 months or the last year? I'm sure it's changed in the last month, but how has cybersecurity really changed over the last year or so?
That's a great question, and we're actually at CynergisTek just parsing our data for our annual report, and I'm happy, I guess, to say in one sense that it aligns with what we wrote in that blog, and that blog was really about the Iranian threats and the wiper attacks, which we were beginning to see, and were threats. Actually, some occurred in Europe and the Middle East. We still, fortunately, have not seen a true wiper attack in this country. But internally at CynergisTek, it started us looking at our data and looking at our hundreds of customers. And we noticed that there's been what we call internally risk inflation. And so what highlighted that for us around the wiper attacks is many of our customers were prepared for ransomware. And they had good run books, and they were able to respond and recover from backups, or even where they had made preparations to pay Bitcoin. They had things in place, and so they weren't going to be caught flat-footed. But when we started looking at the risks around a ransomware attack, it's not just the data that can go missing. It is actually hardware can be destroyed. And that changes the game in terms of recovery. It is not just getting the tapes or spinning up your backup disks and moving data anymore. You actually have to replace machines, and that's a whole different level of recovery. And of course, what we're seeing now in the physical world with coronavirus is because we thought we were prepared and had run books, but we weren't doing the testing, we weren't verifying, we didn't have the surveillance system set up in advance. And there's a direct correlation for cybersecurity there. And that is, you can have all the things in place, like your run book for ransomware, but if you haven't looked at a scenario that's more destructive than ransomware, you're not going to be prepared. So it really does get down to testing, being creative about the scenarios, and anticipating the most unanticipated thing you can think of.
Wow, I mean, that just takes things to a whole nother level when you're talking about, actual hardware and things like that. How do you even begin to approach your conversations with your clients about that? I mean, do they have the proper people in place for things like that? I mean, I think it just, like you said, it escalates things to a whole nother level in terms of what they have to be aware of or consider.
Exactly. And I think you've gotten to the core problem in cybersecurity, and frankly, even privacy. And that is the CIOs and the CISOs and the privacy officers and even the compliance people know what needs to be done. But healthcare has not quite made the leap to understanding that the data is not only their primary asset, it's the most important thing the hospital has is the information on the patients, or any physician for that matter, and able to provide care. But they have not made the leap that it is actually how the hospital runs. So a CIO may begin to understand it from a technical perspective, but what the CEO and the CFO and the chief operating officer and the nursing staff and leadership has to understand is if those systems are down, they cannot do their job anymore. And
Right.
and this is really the key issue, to approach it as a cybersecurity or an IT issue will not solve your problem. You have to have the CEOs aligned. You have to have the CFO on board, because this is an ongoing long-term investment. It's like you wouldn't build a new hospital and never maintain it. You would stop painting it, and you'd never clean the windows, and you wouldn't pay the electric bill.
Right.
And security is really the same way. It has real physical impacts now, because people who do the work, who take care of the patients, who drop the bills, who schedule the appointments, who make sure that the devices are up and running when they need them, can't do what they need to do. So we need to take a step back and go, this is not an IT or security problem. This is an enterprise issue. And the same thing as you're running these playbooks and scenarios, it's fine for the technical people to speculate what would happen when email is down, for example. But what does a doctor or a physician do when Epic is down or Cerner isn't responding? This changes everything, and the IT people are the wrong people to fix it.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, I have a healthcare background and I have worked in a hospital setting for many years. And from my experience, a lot of the folks, the CEOs, a lot of times are more clinical in nature. Where I came from, our CEO was a nurse, and which is, excellent, of course, because they understand patient care and all that goes into that more one-on-one interaction and the holistic approach to patients and things like that. But when we're talking about technology, it's not technology living in a silo. It is technology impacting, sometimes it can be a life or death situation, and it can definitely impact patient care and patient well-being. And so you make up a really good point here when you're saying, the CISOs and the CIOs really need to be very connected to the CEOs or those folks who are maybe more clinical in nature, because they can't afford to live in silos. They must communicate, because the patient is the one who is going to feel the positive or negative thing that can come from that interaction. All parties have to be on board and understanding, and the clinical folks have to really, share their knowledge with the technical folks and vice versa, to really give a full, patient care, a good patient care model to people. And I think a lot of times even lay people in communities don't understand the importance of all of the technical side of things. And I think sometimes even the C-suite folks don't understand how detrimental it can be when something isn't right, or there is, some sort of ransomware or other thing going on that can impact all the technology that directly takes care of the patients there. It's scary. It's a really scary thing to face.
It really can be, and you're absolutely right in that it takes all those people in the organization. If you're doing technology just for the sake of technology, you shouldn't be doing it. The technology should be supporting ongoing operations and your clinical and business functions, and that has to be the clinicians and the business users involved, not just IT and security folks.
Absolutely. So how do you keep hospitals, I think what we're talking about right now, those relationships with all the moving parts and the people, they have to do some internal training, internal ongoing communication. And, patient care is is one part of that that does change. We learn better practices, how to keep patients safer and things like that. But technology is changing so quickly. I can imagine that it can be very overwhelming for a healthcare system to really stay at the forefront constantly to be keeping patients safe in that regard. So how do health organizations work to be more proactive in all of this to keep patients safe?
You know, that really is a great question, and unfortunately, we're living through a real life example of it with the coronavirus right now. We're
Right.
seeing all this push towards getting people to be able to work remotely, including not just telework, but telehealth. And that's a wonderful thing that we have the technology to support that. But just throwing technology at the problem, you want to send, you know, all your billers or coders home, or you want to send IT people home to reduce their exposure in the hospital. But if you've not looked and worked with the clinical people and the people who will be impacted at the revenue cycle people, and plan for that, you may be actually making things worse by sending people home. What will the bandwidth impacts do to your organization if you have now 500 people working from home? What happens if you have a lot of remote access to your EMR instead of, you know, the doctor who's out and just needs to check a chart or sign off on something because he's out to dinner? Now it's hundreds or maybe thousands of people. What impact does that have? And maybe most importantly is, do they have secure access? They may be able to get into it, but maybe it's a physician, a hospitalist who normally works in the hospital, and now because you've had to change staff and you've got coverages because of self-quarantine and that kind of thing, maybe the hospitalist needs remote access but was never given multi-factor authentication. So how does he get in? And these are the kinds of things that people ought to be thinking about now. Actually, it's a little late, but at least planning on it now. The sector, through the Joint Working Group and the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, has published a great checklist for the surge in telehealth. And it only helps if you go down the checklist and use it.
Right.
Putting it in your files and saying I've got it doesn't help. So people have got to start taking all this great advice and putting it into action, and that's always the hard part. But
Right.
if we don't have if this isn't a burning platform today, I cannot imagine what it will take to get us to start behaving a little more foresightedly and with planning in mind.
Yeah, exactly. And in our conversation earlier, we were talking about schools and things like that shutting down, and you mentioned again the bandwidth. Am I right in thinking too, we're talking more about staff members and care providers and how that could impact them, accessing records at all, accessing the right records, being safe. But does that bandwidth issue also then apply if we're looking at telehealth, which is still, fairly new? We have many patients and folks that aren't comfortable with that or don't know enough about it. But if we had to go that route, would we also experience those issues on the patient side of the spectrum with bandwidth? Would that become an issue with people trying to seek care if they are, confined to their homes and things like that?
Absolutely. We a lot of us who take high speed bandwidth in our homes for granted because we have it, forget that there's still a great portion of the country, particularly in rural settings and even in cities where people can't afford those monthly rates for bandwidth. And those may be sectors that aren't close to care anyhow and would most benefit from telehealth. So we need to think about the impacts. There's been a lot of discussion about using more telehealth during coronavirus, but we need to test those assumptions before we just start rolling that out. It could be a huge boon, I think, certainly now, but even for routine care. If you don't need to come in and see a doctor, it's a good alternative. We have some reimbursement issues we have to work through, but
Right.
that's all doable. But I think we have to test some of the assumptions we have that we can flip the switch and deploy the technology. And we haven't thought about the real use cases, the real need, whether the technology is available to the caregiver as well as the patient. And then you get into the issues around privacy and legal issues and just the sheer communication of it.
Right. I think it's fair to say too, you know, when you look at the demographic of folks who might be tapping into telehealth, we might be looking at older audiences who might not be as tech savvy. So you have to think about the learning curve. And unfortunately, that particular demographic sometimes they're the ones that need care the most and the quickest. And then you throw in the learning curve of trying to understand the technology so that it can benefit them. That's like a whole nother layer on top of cybersecurity and things like that. So, you know, I think with the coronavirus being what it is, that we're hearing, you know, changes almost daily, it does put us in a bit of a scary position to feel like we're maybe a little ill prepared, you know, to handle things like that on both sides, on the healthcare system side and on the patient end of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've gotten us back to a cybersecurity discussion point. I was actually reading an article this morning about an emergency response specialist who was actually recommending we declare a health emergency where I live, because she said recovery only starts once you declare the emergency. Well, that triggered many experiences I've had, both as a former CIO and on the consulting side, where we've gone in and we'll go in to exercise their run books. And if you're not testing those things, they're not really valid run books. But her call to declare a disaster before we had run books written was even scarier. I've been to customers where we've gone to exercise a disaster, an incident response plan, and no one in the room knew how to start the incident. So, yeah, you got to have plans in place before you really call the incident, whether it's an exercise or real, and particularly if it's real. So I think that's the message there. We now have a real scenario. This would be a good time to write some run books, to draft some scenarios and drop some things in. On the other hand, I've been at places where the command center director executed the incident and never showed up, and everyone kept working. It was like, oh, so-and-so isn't here, let's just keep doing the exercise. And he would insert new changes. He would literally slip them under the door. And when it was all done, they'd run the exercise, and they realized that they really didn't need that person because their run books were complete and everyone knew what their job was and who to turn to. And that's the point we really need to get to. Not that you're going to cover every single incident that could possibly occur. No one, I mean, if you're in the middle of a ransomware attack and now you've got a coronavirus quarantine, you probably didn't write that scenario. But if you were at least, but if you were at least prepared for the ransomware, it's going to be that much easier to address the other things that are going on. And that's really what we need to do, is we need to exercise our minds, get creative, look at what could possibly go wrong, and then start developing, plans and paths and who needs to get called and where do you engage the marketing people and when do you engage your internal legal counsel and when do you call outside, whether it's a coronavirus or a wiper attack.
Right. Absolutely. It is overwhelming when you talk about it, but it's so incredibly important because there are lives at stake. You just touch on so many interesting things, and it will be interesting. I would love to continue this conversation in like a part 2 6 months from now and see how much has changed. What have we identified as, strengths and weaknesses overall in the industry, and how have we hopefully triumphed over all the things we're facing right now. I think it would be interesting to see what's happened in that time frame between now and then, and to see how we've responded.
Yeah, I agree, Amy, and I hope we're learning. But one of the things we've seen historically in terms of cybersecurity, because the pace of change, as you mentioned, is so rapid now, the threats are changing, the enforcement is changing. We just got a new set of rules on interoperability and information blocking today, which will impact how data is exchanged. And so if you're just doing what you've always done in cybersecurity, you're actually falling behind. And I think that's a whole different message around coronavirus. So doing what you've always done is not going to move you forward. You have got to stay ahead of the threats. You've got to think about what could go wrong, and you've got to think about alternatives to the way you're doing things today in case they need to be pulled on, whether you need to expand home workers or do more telemedicine because your doctors can't get out. They're so burdened in the hospital they can't go to their office and see patients. So I think that's the message. And I wish I could tell you that things were going to slow down and become calmer and more rational, but I just don't see that happening. And I think the message, and certainly computer viruses spread this way, and now we know human viruses spread the same way. But we've got to keep our defenses up. We've got to do our patching. We've got to do all the things we would normally do all the time and not relax, unfortunately. And now, of course, we're seeing the new phishing and fake tracking sites all around coronavirus. And I know, having worked in the hospital, everyone in the hospital is watching the tracking map. So if they get a phishing mail about a new map and they click on it, all of a sudden you may find yourself with a ransomware attack going on. So it's the time we're most vulnerable and susceptible. We have to be most on our guard.
Absolutely. Excellent point. Excellent point. Well, you have really shed some light on some just key topics and things going on right now in the world. And like I said, I would love to do a part 2 of this conversation and see where we're at, 6 months from now, and see how, we have hopefully triumphed or adapted to meet those needs. So thank you very much for, the information, the insight that you've shared today. I think it's especially helpful for our members and for people who we know are dealing with all the things you mentioned, today, dealing with the coronavirus and everything that comes with that. So I appreciate your time and your expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you. And count me in for the follow-up.
All right, will do. Take care, David.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.